I'm Andy from Forta. Apologies about the ridiculous headshot here. I used an AI generating headshot app, and this is the one my wife picked because she thought it looked the best. The other ones were really, really bad. And on my laptop, it looks fine. On a big screen, it looks pretty silly. So I'm just going to take a selfie for the next presentation and use that. Anyway, so I lead the ecosystem team at Forta. If you're not familiar with Forta, the analogy I like to use is that we're like a big security camera and alarm system for Web3. We watch on-chain transactions, could be an L1, could be an L2, and we're looking for suspicious activity. So it could be an exploit, it could be a phishing attack, it could be something that a specific protocol wants to watch, a risk that they care about. And we're constantly emitting public alerts about this stuff and then labeling the entities that are involved in that behavior. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about exploit detection and exploit prevention. So we've talked a lot about kind of end user security through the wallet so far. I'm going to shift and talk about kind of DeFi smart contract security. So a little bit of level setting here. When Forta started in November 2021, there was absolutely no real-time threat monitoring happening. I don't think most dApps even knew what threat monitoring was. The security budgets back then were being used exclusively on smart contract audits and bug bounty programs, maybe formal verification, but those were few and far between too. Over the last 2.5 years, there's been, I think, a recognition that threat monitoring is a useful activity. There's also a lot more teams that provide tools for threat monitoring today. And so, standing here in February 2024, there's a ton of this happening. There's a lot of different techniques that are being used. And what I'm going to talk about today is kind of a shift from pure detection to prevention. So we watch all this stuff happening in real time today. We're getting a lot better at detecting things in advance. Now the question is, what do we do with all this real-time threat intel that we have? So just an interesting sort of data point here. The majority of smart contract exploits are detected in advance today. I don't know if that surprises most of you. Like I said, there's a lot of different techniques for this. But security teams, at least, if you sort of aggregate all the shared intelligence out there today, most of the exploits, someone at least knows about it in advance. 3 primary ways this is happening today. First, we're able to identify the malicious smart contract that's being invoked that carries out the attack. I don't know if you guys sort of are too familiar with the life cycle of a smart contract exploit, but it usually starts with an attacker deploying a malicious smart contract that has some custom logic in there. And then at some point in the future, they'll invoke that contract, carry out the exploit, and then launder the proceeds of that attack. So if you can identify the malicious smart contract that they're deploying on chain and determine that it's malicious, that's one way to sort of key in on the attacker. Combination of static and dynamic analysis on those smart contracts. So we will look at all the opcodes, we'll fuzz the contract, we'll simulate it, we'll throw a bunch of parameters at it, and in a couple, maybe in the span of one block, try and figure out sort of what we think the intention of this contract is. And we'll do that with every new smart contract that gets deployed on chain. And I know there are a lot of other teams out there that take a similar approach. Another thing you can do is you can monitor pending transactions in the mempool. A lot of teams like Blocksec are pretty proficient at this too. They're able to very quickly kind of filter out 95% of transactions as being okay, and then they focus on the few that that they want to spend more time on. They'll simulate those and try and figure out what the result is. And then there's anomaly detection, which is probably the newest kind of mechanism for detecting an exploit. And I describe this as, they're just looking for things that are weird, that fall outside of normal user behavior. And this is another pretty effective way at filtering legitimate versus malicious activity. Okay, so A lot of detection happening, various approaches, all of them are successful. And now the question is, what do we do with all this data? How do we actually prevent these attacks from happening? So existing prevention mechanisms have revolved around pausing protocols or rescuing funds. So you guys are probably aware that most DeFi protocols have some sort of pause function. It's usually triggered by a multi-sig that needs to be kind of manually triggered. My opinion is that those mechanisms were not really implemented for security reasons. They were implemented for governance reasons, and so by nature they're very slow. So they're really not great at responding in seconds to a potential attack. You can also try and rescue funds, which would be like front running a transaction in the mempool. I think one of the challenges with rescuing is that you need to be fast. You need to be able to see the transaction first. You've got to have visibility into it. So if it's a private transaction, it's harder to see, and you also need to be faster than the exploiter. And so, anecdotally, I've heard that some front-running teams think that they can get to like 70, 80% effectiveness. That would be like best case scenario. But I think today it's probably somewhere 30, 40, 50%. So maybe half the time, they can rescue funds successfully or front run with a pause transaction. So we generally think that these approaches that exist today are suboptimal because block times are going to keep decreasing. Private transactions have sort of increased consistently over time, and kind of an existential risk to all of this is like ZK, where things are encrypted and all you see is a proof or something else like that, right? It would be very, very difficult to front run things in that future. So what are some of the things that we're thinking about? So we think the future of exploit prevention should include, not exclusively rely on, but include transaction screening. We have all this real-time threat intel, so let's use it. Some approaches that exist today. At the Forta Foundation, we use a negative reputation-based sort of detection approach, so we're identifying malicious smart contracts. So you can use that to create a public shared list of bad actors and update that dynamically, and you can screen transactions based on that. Anomaly detection is another one. Again, this is where you're kind of you're organizing transactions by sort of what's normal, what you expect users to do, and then what's abnormal. And there's a company here called SphereX. I don't know if they're in the room, but they do anomaly detection and they do it pretty well. The other is positive reputation. I'll give you an example of this. One of the things that we've been kind of thinking about is doing contract age checks. And again, this is relevant for purposes of an exploit. One way to prevent an atomic attack, for example, where everything's happening in the same block, would be to just impose an age check on a contract. So if it's less than X blocks old, they wouldn't be able to interact with your DeFi protocol yet. They need to age, let some time pass, let that contract get screened by us and other providers to determine whether it's malicious or not, and then let it through later. So maybe it needs an age of 10 blocks or 20 blocks or whatever. We think this is interesting because we don't see a lot of legitimate reasons for deploying a contract in the same block that you're invoking it. If you're a legitimate user, it's really just attackers that kind of rely on this pattern today. So an age check doesn't introduce a lot of friction for everybody else. So that would be an example of like a positive reputation check. Okay. Interestingly, you can embed these screening mechanisms at different layers in the stack. We're exploring both. You can do it at the smart contract layer, where a protocol would include some logic in their contracts to screen incoming transactions. And again, you can use positive reputation, anomaly, or negative-based reputation to do that screening. I think the benefits of doing screening at this layer is that there's an upfront cost to upgrading your contracts, but all the subsequent kind of screening work would have a lower cost. So I think it's probably more sustainable economically to do it at the smart contract level. You can also do it at the infrastructure level. You can convince a builder to run a check for you. You can convince a sequencer to run a check for you. And one of the challenges of doing it there is that you probably need to pay. You would need to pay these infrastructure players to kind of run those checks for you. And you would need to do it redundantly across multiple builders or in a shared sequencer environment across multiple sequencers. And so it could be more cost effective to do it at the smart contract level as a result. But we're still kind of early on in our exploration here. So I think both are still really interesting. And frankly, there are teams pursuing solutions at both layers of the stack right now. So we'll kind of see which one wins out. We've written a lot about this over the last couple months. We've got kind of a concept we're calling a threat oracle. Think about it like it would be an on-chain mechanism that is sort of dynamically updated that protocols can use to screen incoming transactions against. And we envision this oracle kind of being a compilation of all the threat intelligence that the security community has. So it wouldn't be just Forta saying, hey, this address is bad. You'd want some consensus from all the other players out there too, which makes sense to us because there's a lot of different approaches that are leveraged. And if you can layer all those approaches on top of each other, you can kind of zero in on bad actors and minimize false positives. Okay, so maybe an obvious question is, wait, doesn't this sound like censorship? Why would we screen transactions? I try not to use that word just because I think it evokes an emotional response in some people. And so we think about it more in the context of like protocol sovereignty. So we just want to give DeFi teams in particular kind of the option to do this. I think whatever exists should be opt-in. Nothing should, screening shouldn't be sort of done by default. I think protocols should have full autonomy and control over whether a check gets run, how that check gets run, who runs it. But we do think that they have a right to manage their own risk. And right now, there just aren't very many tools or mechanisms for them to use to manage that risk, right? Right now, every protocol is just an open door. You have to let everybody in. And we've been forced to ask ourselves the question, like, if we know that this transaction is an exploit, and most of the time we do today, should we let that transaction in? And maybe the answer is yes. However, we at least want teams to have the option of shutting that door for that particular transaction, right? And reverting it or blocking it, whatever the mechanism is. So in support of transaction screening, I wanted to very briefly talk about an RIP that Forta recently proposed along with OpenZeppelin, SphereX, and Ironblocks. I know Ironblocks is here somewhere. These four teams jointly authored RIP 7614. This would give, it would add a new precompile to an EVM that would give more visibility into the call stack. So just to unpack this a little bit for everybody, one of the challenges that transaction screening has today is that DeFi protocol can only see message sender and transaction origin fields of a transaction. So if we were to implement screening today, and an attacker knew that the protocol that they were interacting with or wanted to attack was using some sort of screening mechanism, that attacker could hide deeper in the call stack behind a proxy contract or delegate calls. And it's kind of an unintended disadvantage that exists in the EVM today, but like that visibility deeper in the call stack is not available to the protocol today. The builder can see it. Everyone else in the transaction processing flow can see the full call stack, but not DeFi protocols. So they have an information disadvantage today. And so this RIP is kind of like a black light that would just allow them to kind of see everything that's hidden deeper down, which would make screening a heck of a lot more robust. So if anybody's interested in talking about RIP 7614 or has any thoughts, for or against transaction screening, as a legitimate way to combat exploits, would love to speak with you afterwards. Thank you very much.
Cool. Let's do one question at a time. There in the back.
I'm just curious to hear what would be the arguments against having something like 7614, considering that that data, like you said, is available within seconds.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the feedback. So we've spent most of our time engaging with L2s on this, and we very kind of thoughtfully released it as an RIP instead of an EIP for that reason. For ZK chains, adding any new precompile, to my understanding, would require a custom circuit. I'm not a ZK expert. I honestly don't even, fully understand what that entails. I know that it could be a significant amount of effort. So that's one thing that we need to figure out here. For non-ZK chains, it's much easier. I think it's, to be fair, we're only sort of 3 or 4 weeks into the kind of comment period. And these things take a long time to kind of build momentum. So I think feedback's been that this seems like it would make sense. Makes sense to give protocols the option to do this. No obvious blockers, except for like the technical issues with the ZK EVMs. But we'll see kind of where we are in a month or two. Yep, as the feedback matures.